Hi, I'm Pastor Kurt, and this is your 5-minute Bible study. Today, we're going to look at Acts chapter 15, verses 36 through 41. So we've only got a handful of verses here, but these are important verses. In these verses, we hear about an argument between Paul and Barnabas. Now, at this point, Saul has become Paul, and he will be Paul from here on out. One thing that I really like in the text is that there's no big scene for his name change. A lot of times in the Bible, when people have their name changed, there's a big deal about it. Like Abram becoming Abraham, Sarai becoming Sarah, stuff like that. When people get their names changed, there's a scene in the Bible about it. There's no scene here for when Saul's name gets turned into Paul. It's basically a parenthetical comment by the writer. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, his name was now Paul. And then it's Paul from here on out. In this scene, though, Paul and Barnabas, who have been traveling together, get in this argument. And their argument is about John Mark. Now, I mentioned John Mark in an earlier video because it was John Mark's mother at her house where Peter showed up after the angel released him from prison. So we got kind of a hint or a reference to John Mark earlier because that was his mom's house. Now we hear a little bit about him. John Mark had been traveling with Paul and Barnabas, which is fine. That's great. They've got more people to tell others about Jesus. Wonderful. But at one point, John Mark decided, no, I'm going to go back to Jerusalem. We aren't told why he went back, just that he did. At this point, in this scene, in 15:36 to 41, Paul and Barnabas are arguing about John Mark because Barnabas wants to go back and get him and bring him on the rest of their journeys. But Paul says no. Paul basically says that John Mark turned away, let him go, let's move on. And they argue about this. Barnabas wants to give John Mark a second chance, and Paul is saying no. In the very beginning, in the book of Acts, in the very beginning of the early church, we've got conflict. So when we hear about conflict in the church today, that shouldn't be surprising. It's sad, but it shouldn't be surprising. Even Paul experienced conflict. So what happened? What happened with John Mark? Well, Barnabas and Paul end up parting ways. They don't come to an agreement, they end up splitting, and Barnabas ends up going with John Mark, and they go off to spread the gospel on their own. Paul then picks up other people to travel with him, like Silas, who we'll hear about later. But they split over this argument about this guy who had turned back to go to Jerusalem. We hear a lot about Paul. We know a lot about Paul from his letters. He says a lot about grace and mercy. But we got to remember that Paul was still human too. And he still had his own emotions. He still had his own opinions about people. And right here in this moment, his opinion of John Mark is not very good. Does his opinion of John Mark change? Yes. Later on, in some of his other letters, Paul writes some really good things about John Mark. He doesn't end up traveling with him again, but Paul does speak highly of him. So that means for us that even if there's some other Christian that you don't see eye to eye with, you can still speak well of them. They are still telling others about Jesus. Remember, John Mark went with Barnabas to tell people about Jesus. He's just not traveling with Paul right now. So even if other people are telling others about Jesus and not traveling around with you, that's okay. Yes, they might upset you from time to time. You might want them to do things your way, but they're still telling people about Jesus. And so, like Paul for John Mark, we can still speak highly of them. Even if they're not in our little circle, think about like different denominations, okay? Even if other Christians are out telling people about Jesus and they're not in your denomination, Don't worry about it. Okay? They're telling others about Jesus, and that's okay. So even when there is conflict in the church, whether between individuals back then or individuals now, all of us can still tell others about Jesus. And that's what keeps us united. There's your 5-minute Bible study. Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time. Thanks.